Robbins P. McIntosh Jr., Executive Vice President, Sharon Pokphand Food Public Company, Bangkok, Thailand. Robbins is currently employed as an Executive Vice President for Technical Development of Shrimp Culture within the Sharon Pokphand Group, a global frontrunner in global shrimp industry.
When Dr. Jim Wyban says that we don't have the full genome, I'm happy to announce 3 days ago, the full genome was announced, fully sequenced and annotated in Nature Communications. So the genome exists. So my title of the talk is Shrimp Genetics Are Not Everything. They asked me to do a talk on genetics, and frankly, genetics are not everything, but today genetics seem to be everything. I know that when EMS hit, genetics were blamed. I know that when we have successful harvests, genetics are rewarded. I know that anything that goes bad seems to be genetics today, and everything that goes good seems to be genetics today, and that seems to be the only conversation we have. And other conversations that are very much an important part of shrimp farming have been lost. And so I'm going to talk about what I consider the need to go back to holistic discussions. The interactive discussions, not just one factor genetics, one factor this, one factor that. It is a combination of factors to give success. So this shows a picture of an Indian harvest. This is a successful harvest. But my question would be, is this just genetics? Or has this farmer practiced good management? Has he used a good feed? Has he stocked a good PL? Or is it just genetics? And this is an old farm that I had in Belize Aquaculture, and it was rewarded in the world press by the great success that it was touted to have. And it was always the flock. Flock was the success of Belize. That was the great innovation. Not really. This was healthy shrimp. This was actually Dr. Jim Wyban, SPF. Flock had nothing to do with this success. It was healthy shrimp. But flock is given all, when you talk about Belize aquaculture, it's flock. Really, nobody remembers it was SPF. And SPF was a real argument I had with the owner to start, to allow experimentation with SPF. But for me, SPF is nothing but healthy shrimp. And what's wrong with healthy shrimp? It's not a genetic component. It is strictly a health designation. And I ask, this is our new monodon. And I go, is that genetics? Most people say that's genetics. I genetically improved the monodon to get to this. Actually, it's this shrimp that we created an SPF population for. No selective breeding, just healthy shrimp. And I remember one of the stories Jim told me that basically got me into the SPF business. When he cleaned up the shrimp in Hawaii with no selective breeding, 20% improvement in performance, just by going healthy. And so, genetics are important, but management, feeds, also are important. You can have the same genetics and manage it one way and get a huge benefit. You can take the same genetics and manage another way and get nothing. And too many people don't understand that genetics is not magic. It is a tool that needs to be managed correctly with all the components. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Let's go through the components. Oh, one more slide. So this is kind of the way my mind works. Remembering back in the 1980s, something goes bad, it was always the feed. Oh, the feed company was always to blame for any problem in the 80s. Then when we got to the problems in the mid-1990s, it was always water quality. It was always the water quality not good. And now we've gone to another extreme. When something goes bad, it's always the genetics. We forget about other things. Shrimp farming is a complex interaction. It's not unifactorial. But shrimp genetics are important. It is part of the tools we have now. We have learned to do some systematic breeding. And we've learned as we bred to do it better and better. So we've learned, in my journey through this, I never knew this word robustness. That's an important word. And yes, We can tailor an SPF program to create more robustness in the shrimp. We can create massive amounts of challenge centers so that we can look at the families for every disease that we're interested in and see which families have greater survivorship potential. And again, never forget about health. If you don't have healthy shrimp, you can't breed, because there's this thing called G by E. I love that, G by E. It just comes off the tongue. Genetics by environment. Health is part of the environment. And if you don't have standard environment, you can't do good phenotypic selection. Now, what is SPF? SPF essentially is a controlled program that defines a nucleus breeding center. Now, this is not a country, although you can have within a country a small country. So this is in Thailand. This is an SPF, nucleus breeding center. We have a defined boundary that is monitored for all the pathogens. Within that boundary, you define a clean history, and then you monitor within that with the highest level of biosecurity, so that you know that within your geographic boundary, there are none of the diseases that you are concerned with. It is not relative to a geographic country, a geographic state. It's relative to your definition and definition of your nucleus center. And when you do nucleus breeding, you have to have surveillance. This shows one of the nucleus breeding centers that CPF operates, and I think the number is like 48,000 PCR tests in the last, whatever there is there, 8 years, testing continuously all of the pathogens that are important and ensuring that you never get a positive. Because if you got a positive, your nucleus is ruined. You have to stop there. You have to go back and go through a history of testing clean again. But surveillance is absolutely a requirement if you want to basically define a nucleus. Now, once we have that clean shrimp, that constant environment of health, selection has been so easy. So we look at Ecuadorian programs. They have not made a lot of progress in growth. I don't believe they have a clean environment to do phenotypic selection. But with SPF, we could create very constant selection, and therefore the phenotype in many ways represents the genotype. And so we can see the CP history here, and you see when we first brought in the founders from the Americas, it's kind of what the Americas does today if you're in standard conditions. It was an ADG of 0.18, 0.17, took 140 days to reach my 24-gram target. And then with selection, got faster and faster, so now my target is 30 grams, and I think it says something like 70 days. That's from a PL0, which means basically the beginning of nuclei out. It takes about 70 days to reach 34 grams today. And pictured here is a Vanami from a farm in Malaysia, 150-gram animal, commercial harvest. That wasn't the individual, that was the average harvest. Nowhere else can you do 150-gram Vanami. This is in response to selection. And we've had this discussion of SPT. I don't use SPR because I don't know of any resistant animal except for some monodon by Dr. Lau in Taiwan. Resistance says they don't get infected. Tolerance says they get infected, they don't die. So I use the word tolerance because everything I have and everything I've ever tested gets infected. It's the relative ease at which they die represents the degree of tolerance. And every shrimp has tolerance. If they had no tolerance, they'd always be dead. So it's a degree of tolerance we're talking about. Jim showed the TSV. This shows my TSV from Thailand, where the initial imports were about 45, 50%, and we got it up to 98% over time. Today, there's no TSV in Thailand. The shrimp are so tolerant that the viral loads are essentially zero. Apins, when EMS came, first we had to discover it. What was it? And then when we learned it was a toxin, it really is not a systemic vibriosis, so it's different than talking about a vibriosis, it's a toxicosis. We then can create selection programs for the tolerance to the toxin, and they've been very successful. Once you have created the selection program, once you know what you're doing, breeding can be very, very effective. And white spot, okay, this is the next challenge, because my challenge to myself is to create a biosecureless shrimp, a shrimp that doesn't die, high tolerance to everything. So white spot is the next challenge, and you can see our normal population, 25% survival, but an SPF shrimp starting to be bred under certain circumstances for white spot tolerance, we're up to 75%. We're going to take that to 90%. And people say, okay, you're going to basically select tolerance, you're going to lose your growth. Earlier I talked about asking the question, making the hypothesis. So I made the hypothesis, does slow growth give higher survival? Does fast growth give lower survival? So I took all of the ponds at CP and I divided them into fast growing and slow growing, and then I looked at the mortality rate at a day of harvest, so it's equalized. And I plotted the curve for high growth and low growth. And they look pretty equal, but then you do the statistics, and they're exactly equal. The lines overlap. There's no difference between the mortality rate of fast growing and slow growing. Those are independent traits, and you can have fast growth and high tolerance. And so does the program deliver to the farm? That's the ultimate test. Does the program deliver to the farm? So I took, again, some CPF data from all the ponds harvested in 2012 and then 2016, and I plotted it against the month of harvest, and then I arbitrarily put this line at 30 grams. You can see in 2012, almost no harvest made to 30 grams. In 2016, 35% of the harvests are over 30 grams. Today, we're selling 50-gram shrimp from the ponds. This is a result of selective breeding of an SPF animal that has tolerance. And you can see the genetic improvements. It's visual. I would have never expected this. When I went to Thailand to start this, I never dreamed what would happen. So I took some pictures back from 2002 PLs and then 2016 PLs. The PLs grow bigger. The PLs are more robust. And then the harvest in 2004 or whatever it is, and then a harvest in 2017. The shrimp are bigger. They're healthy. They're beautiful. And I would have never anticipated this. This is a total surprise. People ask, where are you going? I don't know where we can go. I just know that we're still going. The future is yet to arrive. So let's start back. It's not genetics. I went through the genetics. That's important, but it's not the only thing. The shrimp seed must be healthy. I can put good genetics, and if the seed is not healthy, nothing happens. And I can show hundreds of examples of this. Shrimp hatcheries must be modernized. When I first came over, brought some SPF shrimp, no hatchery could produce SPF PLs. The hatcheries must be modernized. We must modularize for constant conditions. We must disinfect. We must understand maturation. We must bring the standard of the hatchery up to equal the standard of the broodstock. What do we mean by modernization? Well, you can read what it is, but we have modularization, disinfection, pathogen-free is absolutely essential. My opinion, certified SPF broodstock, and a good hatchery in a modern facility has QC that has a meaning. They are evaluating the product before it's sold, and they have the discipline not to sell a product that does not pass. SPF broodstock does not remain SPF if maturation operations are careless. And unfortunately today in Asia, more than fair share of maturation is careless. I got a friend in Malaysia. I sell him nice SPF broodstock. His animals at PLs are dying everywhere. You evaluate, oh, I've got Chinese polychaetes. Hey, don't you know you can't use the Chinese polychaete with the SPF broodstock? Oh, but they're so good. They produce so many nuclei. That's not the point. Point is, the farmer is the user. Take a hit on the production so the farmer has the advantage. Are your post-larvae screened? All right, most post-larvae, we can determine the quality just by looking at the Vibrio count in the animal. If the Vibrio count of a green Vibrio, and that's green are not always Vibrio, I know that, but if the green colonies on TCBS are greater than 10 to the 3, that PL has a high probability of failure. Yellow Vibrio, we use 10 to the 4. If it's over 10 to the 4 in the animal, there's a high probability of that animal failing. So there's very simple tests hatcheries can do to really recognize, are you getting the PL that will give you the highest probability of success? Now let's go to feed. Today, feed basically is somebody smells it, they look at the label of the protein, more protein is better protein, and that kind of defines a feed. Feed is more than protein, and feed is more than the smell. Actually, good feed requires good technology. And I think we're losing the fact that feed is a technical tool. And not everybody is producing the same technology today. And if you want the best results from your genetics, you've got to have a good feed. And feeds are ingredients. So good feed mills are going to know how to buy good ingredients. They're not going to buy cheap ingredients. They're not going to buy spoiled ingredients. They're going to pay more and buy good ingredients. And texture matters. I didn't realize this, but I learned this in Belize. You can have hard pellets. Shrimp don't eat hard pellets. They like a texture. They like a crunch. The size of the pellet. Shrimp eat by putting the pellet in the gastric milk cavity. If the pellet is too big, they gnaw. You lose feed. You want the pellet to fit inside, just like you do a medical capsule in your mouth. Clamp it. You don't lose anything. Size is important. And it changes over the cycle. So we're always changing the size to equal the size of the shrimp you're feeding. And the manufacturing process. Actually, feeds manufactured today are much better than in the past. The processes are more definite. If you're manufacturing a good feed, you don't need binders. The manufacturing process will make the shrimp feed bind. Basically, manufacturing is much high-tech today than it was in the past, and it basically allows for a better feed with lower food conversion. Then finally, we go to farm management, the biosecurity. Biosecurity, I will get into, has changed. And then the operations, how you feed, oxygen levels, bottom management, water management, population management, disease. So farm biosecurity, it starts with a clean PL. Most farm failures will be because of a dirty PL. So if you can come up with a clean PL, you're probably 80% home. If we look at Thailand, white spot, when they were screening wild monodon, they were using PCR to screen all the wild monodon, there was still a 35% farm failure in 2002. When most of the country had shifted to SPF and AMI that was, quote, non-tolerant, the failure rate went below 5%. Most failure came from infected PLs. And now, the old biosecurity focused only on virus. And when EMS came, we had to learn new definitions of biosecurity and new ways of approaching biosecurity, which are equally important today as it was in the past. I'm old school. I thought exclusion was biosecurity. No, biosecurity should be defined as creating conditions where disease doesn't happen. So for virus, yes, exclusion. You can exclude a virus. Carriers you can exclude. Clean broodstock, clean PLs. That's all exclusion. But a bacteria, hard to exclude a bacteria from a pond. But we know that if we can limit the population of the bacteria, the toxins aren't produced, and you don't get EMS. So how do we control populations of bacteria? Reduce the feed level to the bacteria, which means excess feed on the bottom. It means sludge accumulations. All the places that create areas for bacteria, the food for bacteria, reduce it. Molasses. Wow, molasses is a beautiful bacteria feed. It hurt me to see everybody throw feed into the EMS ponds and kill their shrimp with the molasses. No, we don't want to feed the bacteria. We want to starve bacteria. And feeding is a part of the biosecurity. When we used to feed by hand, you can't carefully feed, so you always have accumulation. In fact, you wanted accumulation. You wanted enough feed to go from one feeding to the next feeding 4 or 5 hours later. If you look at EMS in a pond, it colonizes feed in 30 minutes. If you have feed accumulation, you're just killing your pond. So with the auto feeder, we can feed small amounts all the time. And a great auto feeder guy will never let a pellet hit the bottom of his pond. They will be consumed before they hit the bottom. So feed management, absolutely essential in this new era where biosecurity rules have changed. And so I come up with a model pond. Now, again, oxygen levels also have had to raise. When I started out, 4 was the model number. That was okay back in 2002. 2010, we raised it to 5. 4 was too low. We didn't get optimum performance. Today, we need to raise it to 5, 8, or 6. 5 will not give you the optimal performance with today's accelerated genetics. So we have to have enough aeration, and generally a preferred aeration is some coming up with diffusers, some with paddle wheels to move the currents. We have the toilet, so we have the center area for quickly removal. We don't want anything on the pond bottom ever. So maybe it's continuous flush, or young ponds, maybe it's a flush every 6 hours. But we don't want anything on the pond bottom. And then we have the feeder, where we define a feed table. Now, the old myth said you had to feed the whole pond. That's a myth. You only have to feed a small area in the pond, the shrimp will come to it. So the table, basically, the best definition of a table is about an area for 600,000 shrimp to feed. So if I have 1.2 million, I have 2 tables. If I have 1.8 million, I need 3 tables. And then those tables can be monitored very easily because you put the tray down, and before we used to guess how much feed, how long to look, here we just put an empty tray and we pull it up. If there's no feed on the tray, we're underfeeding. If there's a lot of feed on the tray, we're overfeeding. It's pretty easy to feed correctly. And controlling disease does not always mean the elimination of the pathogen, although I prefer that. You can live with the pathogen in a stable pond. So if the temperatures are stable, pHs are stable, salinities are stable, oxygens are high and stable, you probably are going to maintain a very healthy immune system in the shrimp, and the shrimp will be able to survive the pathogen. But if we have any of those things that destabilize, the innate immune system of the shrimp takes a hit and disease appears. So you can have low-level pathogens if you can control them with a healthy innate immune system. Use of disinfectants and probiotics just got out of hand. Honestly, if chlorine worked, we wouldn't have EMS. China used chlorine, Vietnam used chlorine, everybody used chlorine. And we still had massive mortality. So if chlorine worked, we wouldn't have problems. Chlorine is not the answer. Disinfectants are not the answer. In fact, they may be part of the problem. And then, can we always be saved by probiotics? I will not comment. We must, as we intensify, be concerned with our environment. We can't be flushing water into the environment. We cannot be flushing our sludge into the environment. We have to have a comprehensive system that captures the sludge, captures the water, recycles the water, and yet allows us to maintain the healthy conditions in the pond. This is all possible, and it's something we all need to be concerned with because we're all tied together into the same environment. And so just let me advertise CP, okay? We do it all. We have genetics, we have clean hatcheries, we provide some farm management, and I think we provide a pretty good feed. So you need to be concerned with the holistic area, not just fixate on one thing. Thank you.